What I'd like to do then is introduce Steve DelBianco from NetChoice. He's the executive director. Steve, presentation, please.
Thank you to all the chairs. My name is Steve DelBianco. I'm executive director of NetChoice, Trade Association of E-commerce and Online Businesses. I want to thank you again for holding the hearing today. What I've said on this cover slide, and I've passed out a copy of the slides, I realize the room doesn't lend itself particularly well for everyone to see it. I brought 60 copies, and I believe staff will put the remainder that aren't used by members of the committee on the table over there. 10 years or so, I've been in front of this group, often as a critic of the streamlined sales tax and what became MFA. But I'm here today as an advocate for a remote sales tax plan. Chairwoman Hickson, I would not call myself an author in any way. I am an influencer of that plan and have worked with Goodlatte and his staff. But I have not seen a draft of the legislation yet. I have many discussions with staff, and I fully expect that Goodlatte will introduce that bill this month in January. I will cover today what is in the bill at a conceptual level, but with quite a bit of facts, and I believe enough knowledge of what's in the bill to be able to field many of your questions. One of the first things I do is try to identify what the bill is called. As you can see on the cover slide, I called it Origin Rules and Revenue Return, because hybrid origin sounds like a genetically modified food crop. It's a terrible name for legislation, and I'm always looking for new names that make better sense. Chairman Goodlatte's principles really are what drove the change that we have in front of us. And Max, I'm trying to do an advance here. Could you advance for me? Thank you. When MFA came over from the Senate and went to Chairman Goodlatte's Judiciary Committee, the chairman was not a fan of the approach, as Neil and Max told you. Chairman Goodlatte agreed that there's a fairness problem, and he wants a way for states to get their uncollected sales tax, but right off he said that MFA was not the way. And then in September of 2013, Goodlatte published the principles you see in front of you. These are the 7 principles he called as being necessary for remote sales tax. And he said on the day of introduction that MFA failed all 7. They're all good as far as NetChoice and our industry is concerned, but key for us was principle number 2, called tech neutrality. And that says that the tax compliance burden on online sellers should not be less, but neither should it be greater than for a similarly situated offline business. And in April of 2014, just last year, Chairman Goodlatte held a hearing asking for alternatives that meet his principles. Steve Kranz, Joe Crosby, NetChoice, R Street presented a number of alternatives. And NetChoice presented a concept that was based on an origin rates and rules using a multi-state compact for all states to return the revenue to states. Now that is similar in some respects to the interstate fuel tax agreement, international fuel tax agreement, whereby we no longer see the back of trailer trucks with dozens of license plates for all the states they frequent. Instead, they have a plate for their home state, and when they file in their home state, they include the miles driven and pay the tax for all the states that they drove through. And then a clearinghouse formed by this multi-state compact distributes the revenue to the states. When we first met with Chairman Goodlatte, he alerted us to that as an idea he was very interested in pursuing, and that was part of what NetChoice presented in April. So you, as legislators and everyone in this room, already understand the origin sales tax collection system quite well. Next slide, please, Max. Because all of you use origin sourcing for all of your in-store sales. On anything that we buy while we're here in New Orleans, origin rules and local government retains our tax money. It's something I bought at the airport last night. They don't ask me where I live to figure out whether that t-shirt was taxable in Virginia this month. No, that origin sourcing is what all the states who have a sales tax use for the vast majority of sales. Now, how about phone, mail order, and online sales? Max, thank you. It turns out that over half the US population uses origin-based sourcing for sales within the state that are done by mail order, by phone, or by online. It's 17 states, but over half the US population. And the chart you see there shows that states that use it, and many of them are in the streamlined. Now, origin sourcing works so well that the SSTP member states fought to keep it. Chairwoman Hickson talked about the idea that there was a support for destination-based sourcing, but that was only for interstate sales. Streamline originally wanted everyone to switch to destination sourcing, but the states don't want to switch. The states jealously guarded the ability to keep origin-based sourcing for shipments that occur within the state's borders, even though they are online or catalog transactions. And so that SSUTA was amended to allow all these states to keep their origin sourcing for shipments that occur within the state. Now, you could have used origin sourcing for out-of-state sales as well, but this organization and SSTP went down the path of destination. Meanwhile, the quantity and complexity of local sales tax regimes has continued to grow and diverge, while the internet is making it easier for small businesses to reach customers anywhere. Now, these trends argue against the wisdom of a destination regime, and moreover, the congressional MFA language kept reducing simplification requirements from the fixes that Chairwoman Hickson talked about 15 years ago. The MFA looks nothing like the simplification requirements that were in place, that you were proud to put in place a dozen years ago. But I know this group committed a long time ago to the destination path, so I appreciate you being open-minded about origin today. Next slide, Max. Chairman Goodlatte's proposal is a hybrid using origin rules and revenue return, and here's a picture that I hope to tell the story. In this case, it took 2 states, Virginia and Maryland. In this case, a Virginia-based store, catalog, or online website is going to collect the exact same tax on an order that comes in from Virginia, someone that walks into the store, or an order that comes in from Maryland. They file just like they do every month now. They file with Richmond, Virginia, and then Richmond uses the clearinghouse to return any money that came from Maryland taxpayers to the state of Maryland, along with a file identifying the zip code origin of where those purchasers came from. So in that respect, it looks quite simple, but the key to it, next slide, Max, is in a multi-state compact. So here's how it works, and I have a handful of textual slides that I think that will answer many of your questions. So Congress would authorize a multi-state compact that deals with interstate commerce. Why? Well, because it can. Congress can deal with that. States that join the compact, they would require in-state sellers to apply the home state rates and rules on their interstate sales, no matter where the customer lives or how the sale is made. Now, the states then have an incentive to join the compact because that entitles them to receive the taxes that was paid by their state residents when they purchase from those sellers in that state. And again, it's via the revenue that's returned from the clearinghouse. So simple so far, and what gives Chairman Goodlatte's proposal? Parity between online and offline sales tries to address questions that each of the chairs have asked about fairness or equality. There are 3 kinds of parity in Goodlatte's approach. First is transaction parity. Gosh, remote transaction parity sounds like a great name for Goodlatte's bill, although I think that Representative Chaffetz has already decided to use that name for his. And it's truly transaction parity because every seller, whether brick and mortar or online, will apply their home state rates and rules on the sales that they make. When it comes to compliance parity, every business in the state follows the very same rules and deals with the tax authorities where they are located, the tax authorities where they pay taxes, where they vote, and where they live, and where they already file sales tax. And then finally, audit parity, the thorny problem of multiple audits, 46 different states auditing a seller in your state, goes away. It disappears because sellers are audited only by the state that they're homed in, they're based in, along with any other state where they had a physical presence. Now, Goodlatte does make it work better for you because he preserves your tax jurisdiction over sellers via physical presence. Sellers still use the destination rates and rules into any state where they have a physical presence. Goodlatte does not change the basic principle that physical presence creates tax jurisdiction for a seller. But he does codify what physical presence means because it's an endless source of problems when states aggressively or creatively interpret what physical presence could mean. There are 3 key conditions. Either an employee assigned to the state creates physical presence, or if you use the services of an exclusive agent that's necessary to maintain your market in that state, or if you lease or own tangible and real property. This is similar to the BATSA legislation definition, and the physical presence standard would exclude de minimis presence of less than 15 days in a state by an employee in a taxable year. And it might even exclude presence or conduct that was limited to transient business activity, like a sales call. Now, the next bullet on there is key because it would prevent or preempt states from expanding their physical presence beyond the definition in the bill. So for purposes of sales tax, states could not attempt to impose tax obligations, sales tax, based on, say, advertising or affiliate arrangements or commonly controlled groups. It's an important preemption, and it's vital for the members of my group, NetChoice, as well as a lot of businesses that are struggling with that problem. It's one of the motivations for NetChoice to get to the table and say, yes, we need a federal solution. And finally, for states where a seller has no physical presence at all, well, the seller applies the tax rates and rules for their home jurisdiction. So I've heard lots of concern about gaming in the sense that would companies simply designate their home jurisdiction in a low-tax state? And the answer is, well, no. It would be extremely difficult to do that, since the home jurisdiction is defined in this bill would be wherever most of your employees are working, and that had to be verified via payroll tax records. Next slide, Max. Now, that covers the sales tax states and the sellers there. But what about sellers in the non-tax states? First, I should say that NetChoice doesn't believe that sellers would move to New Hampshire, Delaware, Montana, Oregon, and Alaska, as delightful as those places are, solely based on sales tax. Businesses select your jurisdictions for a host of reasons: quality of life, professional employee quality, business incentives, including tax incentives, income and property taxes, workforce quality. For example, the online seller Newegg, which is a top 10 online retailer, chose to base their operations in New Jersey, 80 miles away from tax-free state of Delaware. Amazon chose Seattle when it could have chosen Portland, which is just a couple of hours to the south, a state that has no sales tax. A real business won't move most of its employees to another state just to avoid sales tax. Few consumers, frankly, care enough about sales tax to switch where they buy. Example, Amazon maintains its sales growth every time they add sales tax and start collecting in a new state. And Amazon will be collecting for 2/3 of the US population by late next year under current law. So we, at NetChoice, we embraced Goodlatte's principle number 5 for tax competition, and we did not propose any measures affecting sellers or citizens in the non-tax states. Nevertheless, and this is key, especially for Representative Major here and Almy, so Chairman Goodlatte has heard that the tax havens concern was the chief problem with his concept. And he's heard that concern so many times that he has a proposal to solve it, and it's in the legislation he'll introduce this month. For the states, the 5 states without a sales tax, those states have a choice. They could join the compact. By doing so, they would receive revenue, tax revenue from their citizens when they bought from sellers in those states that were in the compact. Their state residents would still pay no sales tax.
Just so you know, I mean, I've set my 10 minutes. We're at 10 minutes. So we'll give you a little bit more, so if you can kind of speed it up just a bit, please.
Madam Chair, apologies. Staff had given me the indication I could take more time as the only one to sort of explain the concept. And I took that to heart. Perhaps I should have checked with you first.
I think that's reasonable, too.
I think that's a reasonable accommodation, too, but I didn't want to start
That's
the
great.
hearing by breaking my own rules.
I understand completely, and apologies for that. I think that if I knew it was a strict 10, I could probably have compressed it. I only have
Thank
3
you.
more slides. Thank you. State residents in New Hampshire would still pay 0 sales tax when they buy from any store in New Hampshire. It has no effect on what occurs there. Now, federal law, according to Chairman Goodlatte, his law would require sellers in the non-tax states, including New Hampshire, to either do one of 2 things: report all of your remote sales to the clearinghouse, which they would share with the state in order to do use tax compliance, or collect sales tax on those remote transactions using a flat rate and a standard set of definitions and exemptions that would be determined by the clearinghouse. Now, states that would seek to audit sellers in New Hampshire would be a little different story. If New Hampshire was a compact member state, then New Hampshire would do the audit. If New Hampshire stayed out of everything, didn't join the compact, well, then that auditing state would have to either compensate you to do the audit, and if you didn't feel like doing it, the clearinghouse would have to do the audit of a New Hampshire seller. Now, when we compare Goodlatte's approach with MFA, here are the advantages we see, and I have just 3 slides on that. Max? First, you don't need certified solution providers, so there's no need to pay the CSPs up to 8% of the taxes collected. This is so simple to administer that no CSPs are necessary, nor is there a need for a governing board. like the SSTP. Sellers would face audits only by their home state or by states where they have a physical presence, and of course we define physical presence. And when filing in their home state, sellers would report the sales tax transactions from their out-of-state purchasers, and they do so by appending a file to their monthly filing. They append the file showing the date, the sale, the tax amount, and the zip code of the shipping or billing address. That appended file is sufficient to allow you to identify which residents of your state paid the tax. Next slide, Max. You don't need a small seller exemption at all. One of Chairman Goodlatte's basic conditions is, if you need a small seller exemption, then this isn't as simple as it seems. So this does not, legislation calls for no small seller exception at all, not even a temporary one, as other legislation has. This will work for catalog customers doing mail orders, which is 1 in 10 Americans, and I believe one of the panels coming up after me will deep dive into the catalog story, and I won't use any of my time for that. Third bullet, federal courts would hear disputes about home jurisdiction, the taxation of sellers in the non-tax states, and the interpretations of federal law in the compact. That's federal courts, not state courts, so it overrides the Tax Injunction Act for those purposes. Next, consumers are protected from double taxation. This answers Chairwoman Altoff's question. Consumers would not be liable for any use tax that was greater than the sales tax they paid when they bought from a state that collected a sales tax. Nor would purchasers be liable, nor would the state be liable to refund any of that money if it exceeded the in-state use tax rate. Congress would require the clearinghouse in the states to adopt privacy and data security standards, and I think that goes without saying. So to conclude, just a few more advantages. It avoids the due process problems with Marketplace Fairness Act. There is no basis of concern about equal protection or constitutional concerns that you may hear later today. And neither MFA nor the Judiciary Bill, Goodlatte's bill, would do a thing to force foreign sellers to collect your sales tax. To my astonishment, advocates of MFA spent millions on television commercials just before the end of the lame duck, suggesting that Alibaba and Chinese sellers would somehow exploit a loophole if MFA were not passed. Nothing could be further from the truth. Neither MFA nor Goodlatte's bill could do anything to force a foreign seller to collect. This is an easy new report for sellers to do the tax collected by zip code, and sellers would follow the rates and rules where they live. It isn't taxation without representation because the sellers are the ones being taxed. Finally, it maintains state sovereignty over state rules and rates on businesses that are within your borders. So, Max, I put this flow chart back up as to closing to say that Goodlatte has the same goals as this group: revenue, realization, and fairness. But it uses the opposite approach from MFA. The MFA destination approach is conceptually simple, but as you see, it turns out to be very complex to implement. Whereas Goodlatte's approach is conceptually more complex, but is very simple to implement. I look forward to your questions, but if you have ideas as well, we want to get them to Chairman Goodlatte. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to note that we've also been joined by President-elect and Task Force member Kurt Bramble from Utah. Senator Bramble, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Do any of the task force members have any questions for Mr. DelBianco? Senator Bramble.
Thank you, and I apologize for being late. We have a very traumatic situation back home with the speaker who's critically ill. Mr. DelBianco, did I understand you to say that for the first time in the history of the nation that the federal government would be imposing a sales tax on sellers, and it would no longer, so this would be a federal sales tax imposed on sellers that would be required by federal law? Is that what you just told us?
Max, could I get you to return to the slide on the non-tax states? Slide 9, thank you. Thank you, Senator Bramble. I don't know if it would be the first time, but Goodlatte's proposed solution to the tax haven problem.
Specifically, Mr. DelBianco, the question is this a federal intrusion imposing, this would be the federal government imposing a sales tax which would open the door, the nose of the camel, the foot in the door, whatever, to the federal government imposing a sales tax? That's a yes or no question.
Under Goodlatte's approach, the federal government would force sellers to collect the sales tax that your residents are paying and return it to your state. So I think the answer is yes to the question that you asked.
Thank you. It seems like the answer is a definite yes, that this would be the first time that the federal government would be stepping into the arena of imposing a sales tax, which from a state perspective is a very, very serious intrusion of federal power.
Do you have the same concern, Senator Bramble, about MFA, since it also requires that sellers in New Hampshire begin to collect a tax?
The question is, who is the taxpayer, Mr. DelBianco, and the history of sales tax, it is the purchaser who's the taxpayer. This, under your proposal, Mr. Goodlatte's proposal, it would be the seller who would be the taxpayer, and that's a very real concern. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Representative Major?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for taking my question. On how it works for states without a sales tax, your second major bullet says, report all remote sales to the clearinghouse, which may share that data with states to assist them in use tax compliance. Now, out-of-state buyers that come, say, to New Hampshire, if they physically come to New Hampshire, would the seller have to report that sale to the clearinghouse?
No, Delegate Major.
And only if it was a remote sale
Interstate.
interstate. Now, right now, the New Hampshire businesses do not have to report to anybody. But now that you're going to create a federal law which will be new on businesses in order to be able to collect taxes and send them to another state. Is that correct with this?
It is. It's identical in that respect to the Marketplace Fairness Act that this group supports. Both would put new obligations on sellers in New Hampshire.
So then,
It was our position that wasn't necessary, since we didn't believe the tax haven problem was sufficient to warrant this. But Chairman Goodlatte has become convinced that he needed to solve the tax haven problem with this concept.
Isn't, if I may,
Yes, please continue.
isn't this a so-called new tax?
In the same respect of MFA, it is a new tax election obligation imposed on sellers in states that have no sales tax at all.
Thank you.
Other questions from any of the members? Senator Harper from Utah.
Thank you. On your website, Mr. DelBianco, you've got 21st Century, AOL, eBay, ERA, Expedia, Facebook, Google, Living Social, Lyft, Overstock, PayPal, Sidecar, True, VeriSign, Yahoo, Vigilant, as others as members. Can you tell us which of those members support this proposal of a hybrid origin that you're discussing today? Which of your members do?
All of our members support this. Now, they support the concept that NetChoice presented in testimony in April. The testimony we presented in April did not try to impose new tax obligations on New Hampshire businesses. It did not believe that we needed to have a tax haven solution. So
Okay.
with that distinction, Senator Harper, just an important distinction, because it's Chairman Goodlatte who, in his wisdom, is adding what you have on the slide in front of you. And I do not know whether all of the NetChoice members will rally behind that particular provision.
Okay. Now, help me understand. You talked about how this proposal works. Can you flesh out how this proposal treats all taxpayers the same? If you're talking about in a sales tax state, a non-sales tax state,
So-
people that are purchasing from out of the country, how does that go through and basically create the equity that's called forth in the Constitution?
Thank you for your question. So the taxpayer, in the case of a sales tax, is in all instances the business that collects the tax and remits it to the state where they're liable to pay it. And something like a third of the states who have a sales tax call it a business privilege tax. So in those cases where the taxpayer is the business, they almost always pass it on to the consumer. But it does treat the taxpayer as the business the same in all instances. And it's in that respect that it's more equal, more parity in its treatment than even MFA. On the other hand, you may view that the taxpayer is the consumer or the purchaser. And in this case, the consumers or purchasers will pay the tax from a business as if they got in a car and drove there. It's as if when I bought on at the airport last night from a T-shirt shop that specializes in Mardi Gras items, my visit to that store is physically last night is no different than my visit to that store over the telephone or the internet. In all cases, I'm visiting that store, availing myself of their goods and services, and the taxes that they pay to the state of Louisiana factor into the cost of the items they sell to me. I would not pay the same tax for that T-shirt if I bought it from someone in another state. And that might seem to be an inequality or a difference. But those differences arise every time our consumers buy things from different vendors in different places. They all have different cost structures. In many cases, the different cost structures are a result of the tax policies, gross receipts, corporate income tax, and other taxes that affect the cost of doing business in a different state.
Okay, thank you. Just one statement here, if I may, Madam Chair. As we know, over the years, we've had states that have joined streamlined sales tax, including Kansas and Washington, that have changed from origin to destination, but that was their choice. It was an act of their legislature. Other states of Utah, Tennessee, Ohio, and others have chosen to remain with the origin sourcing. But again, this goes back to whose policy is it and who controls sales tax, which has always been a state issue, not a federal issue. Thank you.
Well stated. Again, another question from Representative Major from New Hampshire, and then we'll take another question from Representative Almay from New Hampshire as well.
Probably isn't the same one.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This just for clarification. I would like to understand where, in one of your slides, it says states joining the compact require in-state sellers to apply home state tax rates and rules. When you say home state tax rate, do you mean one rate for the whole state? Or some states, between the 50 states, there's 6,000 different rates. Does this simplify it and say there's only going to be one rate per state, or what?
Thank you for your question. It does not. The home state rate is meant to imply that the seller uses the very same rate, and that could be a combination of their state rate plus a local rate. So a seller in Richmond, Virginia might have a state rate and a local rate. They use the same rate whether somebody walks into their store, calls on the phone, buys from a catalog, or buys from the internet. So it's meant to their home jurisdiction tax rate, which could include a local component.
So if they don't get it right, they're subject to audit.
That's right, from their home state, and only from their home state. But remember that those sellers are filing every month today, because every time they make a sale to a in-store or a in-state resident, they already collect and file. There's no change to the fact that they filed in their home state. There's no change to the rules they follow. There's no change to the rates or the sales tax holidays.
Representative Almay, is that your
Sorry,
question?
No, I had a different one, but I think I figured it out. This does increase the compliance burden on New Hampshire and the state.
And there is.
So it is
May I ask you to say that just slightly louder into the microphone?
This does seem to increase the compliance burden on New Hampshire just about as much as yours does. And I think it's unconstitutional if we joined the compact.
Thank you. We also have questions from Representative Flynn from Texas, and then Assemblyman Ortiz from New York. Representative?
Yes, thank you. My question is more of a method of how we're handling it. I know when we were here and we had our surge on the Capitol, and we went and I probably talked to maybe 15 members from the state of Texas. And of course, I thought we just did an outstanding job of articulating our position, and I was just real pleased with it, but in my own mind, I still had questions. But the one question that kept coming back to everyone was, this is a new tax. Now, I've got all the talking points. I understand that it's a tax that's there. It's a fair tax, but it's still, you're looking at it, and you're hearing from the members here, it's considered a new tax. And I don't think there's a lot of desire in Washington right now to do anything that would increase or create a new tax. Your sales job on it is going to have to be much better than what's happened.
It's a great observation, and there are some who will not be sold. There are some who will be so dead set against the new compliance burdens and the new taxes that would be paid that neither MFA nor Chairman Goodlatte's proposal would get the votes. But Chairman Goodlatte is committed to solving your revenue problem and the fairness problem between brick and mortar and online. He's committed to do that. And he's committed to doing a solution that he believes will get the support of the people in this room, which is
But-
one of the reasons he's trying to solve the non-tax states.
But consumers are more active than they've ever been.
I think you're right about that. Consumers are.
And so what happens is even members that might see it as a fair tax, they're going to be overwhelmed. And because you have not jumped across there to convince everyone that it's not a new tax. And,
Representative, I think you're correct, and that problem confronts either Representative Chaffetz's modified MFA or Chairman Goodlatte's proposal. The question would be whether it can be made simple enough with a new approach that it removes the objections of businesses that would find it impossible to comply with MFA.
I know in our state, the only way that we could get anyone with any interest in it is if we were going to replace like a franchise tax that we
Offset
have,
it.
which is very unpopular.
Tax offsets.
But,
But that could be done here as well.
yeah, but a real sales job needs to be done because I just listen to the people around this room and it's a new tax.
And I've been amazed at the effectiveness of the sales job as you use it. Whenever NCSL comes to Washington, you storm Capitol Hill and make quite an impression on those offices. I know because we visit the same offices. That same sales job could be brought to bear with a different approach by switching to the origin system that's already covering more than half the U.S. population, covers all of your stores. By switching to that, I believe you overcome so many of the objections and constitutional problems of MFA. But that will not be sufficient to get the votes of somebody who says no new taxes.
That's right.
Assemblyman?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. DelBianco. My question is more into implementation. If Congress were to grant collection authority under a hybrid system, do you anticipate any problem with the implementation? And if yes, why, and not why?
Thank you for the question. As I characterized when I closed the last slide, this is conceptually difficult to explain, the Goodlatte plan. But it is so simple to implement that it doesn't need certified solution providers. It doesn't need significant software modifications, and it doesn't even need a small seller exception. All taxes would be collected from $1. So in contrast to MFA, the implementation of Goodlatte's solution is dramatically simpler, even though, as you're seeing from this discussion, the concept itself is tough to get your arms around.
Thank you.
Additional questions? I again, with the latitude of the committee, Mr. DelBianco, I don't think that I heard the answer to one of the questions that I had asked earlier, that does it, in fact, increase the tax burdens for any consumer that makes purchases from sellers in states that have higher sales tax rates than their own state?
They will pay a higher tax when they buy from California than if they bought from Virginia, in the same respect as if they were traveling here. And they will pay a lower tax if they bought from Wisconsin, even though they may live in California. So some will pay higher and some will pay lower, but in all cases, their dollars return to the state where they live.
Okay, so that then my next question would be then, does this consumer then become legally required under a state's use tax to remit the portion of the tax that wouldn't be paid because now they're paying a lower tax in a state that has a lower tax rate?
Knowing that that was your question, I have it on the next slide, and I stated it clearly, that there is no liability for a use tax in your state if it happened to be higher than the sales tax you paid to that Wisconsin website when you bought that. There is no liability, nor does the state have to return money if their home state rate was higher than the rate where you live. The idea is to keep it so simple that we treat all sales the same, transaction parity.
So again, I'm going to go back to what Senator Bramble had asked earlier. So what you're telling me is that basically the federal government is telling states that in order to collect these types of taxes, their tax no longer precedes the tax in another state. They would have to acquiesce to that rate, whatever it is.
For that item purchased from that state, the answer is yes. And Congress is using its interstate commerce authority, but it's not mandating anything since states have to do this only if they decide to join the compact.
Representative Major?
Can I make another observation?
Absolutely, sir.
in looking at this, and let's say it goes through, then let's say I'm from a non-sales tax state, so I'm a seller, and see this very complicated system where I'm going to have to comply federally. And so maybe what I might do is I might sell inventory to a foreign seller, and that foreign seller makes it available to anybody in any state, and therefore nobody gets any of the sales tax. Would that be correct?
That's the way I'm interpreting it, sir.
The incentive to move your sales to so-called tax havens is something that Chairman Goodlatte can only do so much to stop. He is attempting to say that you can't move to New Hampshire to escape the tax, but he can never stop. Nobody can stop people from moving out of the country.
That's not my question. My question is, if I'm a seller in a non-sales tax state, and I make my inventory available to a foreign seller, that means somebody that is not domiciled in the United States.
But would you still be the seller of record, Representative Major, in New Hampshire? Because if the seller is still in New Hampshire, it makes no difference at all where the item happens to be shipped from.
No, but if I put out the word, you can buy my product by buying it from a foreign seller.
So you're a manufacturer, for instance.
Right.
Great. And the answer is yes, they could do that, and the U.S. has very little it can do with either MFA or Goodlatte's bill to stop that. It would take trade agreements with virtually every other country before we could force sellers from Canada, sellers from Europe or China to collect and remit our sales taxes. Madam Chair, any further questions?
Just one last one. If California does not tax something, would a California seller impose the tax if the product is taxable in the buyer state?
I think you probably suspect the answer is no, because California sellers are supposed to tax everything the same. To do transaction parity, that California business already knows what the rules are. California may not tax a certain element of clothing, swimsuits, for instance. And if they don't tax them, they don't tax them. It doesn't matter whether the buyer traveled through the internet or traveled in a car or an airplane to get there. The idea is to treat all sellers and all transactions the same.
Thank you. And our last question is from staff.
Steve, the question I have is, you talk about a compact. If a state doesn't join a compact, then what sale, and someone buys from that state, what happens?
States that have a sales tax, Neil, the 46 that do, and if they do not join the compact, then they aren't getting any revenue, and they're not imposing new obligations on their sellers. However, the citizens of that state, when they buy from compact states, are paying the sales tax that's due in those states. So there is a huge incentive for the states to join the compact to have access to bring their citizens' revenue back home.
So, but if you're buying from a state, California doesn't join the compact, you're in Virginia and you buy from California, what happens? Do you pay
California
sales tax?
taxes the transaction. The federal law would prohibit the purchaser from being liable for use tax, and California would retain that revenue.
So California would be required to collect sales taxes for other from others?
They already are, because if you and I
from
travel to
out-of-state
California,
residents, from out-of-state residents.
yeah,
from
if you and I
out-of-state
travel to California, we will pay a sales
They would be required to
tax.
collect sales tax from out-of-state residents and then keep that money.
That's right, until the state of the resident joins the compact. That returns that tax revenue to the state where the resident lives. But the idea here is to treat a sale as a sale is a sale. I've heard that said so many times by advocates of MFA. So the truth is, a sale is a sale is a sale, whether I did it through airplane, through the car, or through the internet, over the phone, or through a catalog.
But Congress is telling states that don't want to participate, they have to.
No, Congress is telling states that don't participate that you don't have to do anything at all.
And they will get money from other states? So
No, they
California
won't until
doesn't-
they join the compact. You have to
So
join
what
the
happens to that money then? Is it say?
It's retained, as I said earlier. California retains the tax. If I go to California and buy something now, they retain my tax. They don't send it back to Virginia. The
But-
same thing would be true if I did it online.
So California doesn't join the compact, and California residents are paying sales taxes in other states. Is that money then sent back to California?
If California joins the compact,
And if
they'll
it
get that
doesn't,
money
what
back.
happens to that money?
Again, if the state doesn't join the compact, The clearinghouse is not going to give them their share of the collections.
So what happens is
They stay where they
clearinghouse-
were collected and filed,
clearinghouse
exactly
maintains
the way
the
it
money?
works today.
Clearinghouse maintains?
Oh,
the
no,
money?
no, no. California maintains it.
No.
If you and I travel to California and make a purchase, Neil, the money stays in Sacramento. It's exactly the same.
No, but if they, never mind. You're not getting what I'm saying. A state that does not join the compact, and their residents buy out of state, they're charged the sales tax, and under the system, that sales tax would go back to that compact state. Now, if they're not in the compact, what happens to that
The money
sales
stays
tax?
in the state where the seller filed their tax return, which is exactly what happens when you and I travel
So
there
it
to make a
doesn't go to the
purchase.
clearinghouse?
No, it does not. The clearinghouse only distributes money that the states who join the compact are entitled to receive.
Then, exactly.
One-
Well,
well,
yes,
just one-
obviously, of course. Representative Flynn?
Just one step.
From Texas?
I think what's kind of coming to all of our minds is that we don't have a whole lot of confidence in the federal government taking care of this, because they don't have a good track record. And it's getting more complicated, and as the states, they like to be able to control their own destiny. And as I've said many times, states created the federal government, and it looks like it's another opportunity for the federal government to get involved. While I agree that it is a tax that's already there, needs to be collected, but I'm not sure I want the federal government.
Personally,
Clearinghouse.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I have a low confidence in the federal government. But Chairman Goodlatte is convinced that just like MFA, the federal government has to do something.
Well, and that's what, you know.
He's looking to minimize the federal
Yeah.
government's role.
Well,
because
the purpose of this organization here is to protect the states.
Indeed. And what he's trying to do is protect the state's access to their tax revenue. In this case, he's saying to use something like a international fuel tax arrangement. The clearinghouse that they run is a very lightweight organization, and we could model this organization on exactly what they do today. So it isn't a federal bureaucracy. It's in fact a compact-run organization, much like what Craig runs for the SSTP
It's
today.
kind of like our president said, though, it is the camel getting its nose under the tent.
I can see that, as MFA is the same.
That's right.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We are going to deviate from the agenda a little bit, and I'm going to ask panel 3 members to take the table. As opposed to panel 2, we'll just switch them around, and that would be Hamilton Davison from the American Catalog Association and Devin Whitney from PayPal. I also would like to note for the committee that we've been joined by Wisconsin staffer Dan Schmidt. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We understand travel's been a little bit hard for most of us. Are you ready, gentlemen?
Yes, ma'am.
Please, again, identify yourself, and which one's going first?
I will,
Thank you.
please. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm Hamilton Davison. I'm the President and Executive Director of the American Catalog Mailers Association, and I am the new guy here. I think you probably have all forgotten more about sales tax than I know, so I'll just put that disclaimer right up front. I'm actually a business guy. I'm not a lobbyist or an association jock or a lawyer. My background is as a business person, and I formed and represent a group of remote sellers, in this case catalog marketers, who also use the internet and virtually every other channel. Some of them certainly have retail stores as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I think my presentation is being handed out. It's fairly straightforward. And I'll walk through it, and then I'd love to entertain any questions you have. Next slide, please. Oh, thanks. Perfect. So a little bit about the catalog industry. It's actually quite an old industry. Started with Ben Franklin, and at the very beginning of our great nation's founding. And it's pretty pervasive. About half of America buys from the catalog once a year. And those orders come in via the internet, about 60% of them via the telephone. And still, even today, about 10% come in via the mail. And that number is a little misleading because it really depends on the demographics of the consumer, the age principally, and where they're located. Typically, older Americans and rural Americans tend to mail in more orders than other groups. And I think that's probably fairly obvious as to why. Catalog shoppers are of all ages, but are also significantly skewed towards older Americans, and that's probably fairly intuitive also. As one gets older, one may not locomote as well, or want to get out, or may just be busy. Certainly as we get older, we tend to get busier, and the catalog is available when you're ready, not needing to adhere to any store hours. And catalogs provide a lot of social and cultural value that you don't get otherwise. Having lived in rural areas myself, I know that it's not always easy to get to stores, sometimes the weather, sometimes just the sheer distance. So catalogs provide a breadth of assortment that you wouldn't enjoy as a rural consumer. They certainly serve people that are either shut in or infirm, or maybe it's something that you want to buy that you're not quite comfortable purchasing in public. It's a private product that you want to purchase. They're also useful in that way. Our concern when we heard about the Marketplace Fairness Act was the complexity of compliance. And our members are not particularly worried about the collection of sales tax. Certainly they're collecting sales tax in any state they have a physical presence in today, but they are very concerned about the cost and the complexity of complying with at least what has been discussed so far under the MFA. And such as we've been able to review it so far, the hybrid origin sourcing seems to be a much simpler solution for us because it's what we're already doing. We just apply it to all of our orders versus having to create and manage and set up the complexity of I've heard it's as many as 10,000 different taxing jurisdictions, certainly a wide variety of definitions and tax holidays and other requirements. We did a study, and it's available on our website. The short URL is listed at the bottom as well, but we had a study of what it would cost small and medium-sized catalog marketers to comply with MFA as we understood it at the time. As, granted, it may have changed a little bit under Chairman Chaffetz or Representative Chaffetz's proposed modification, but based on the initial MFA bill that was passed through the Senate on the 113th, it's somewhere between, call it $100 and $250,000 to set up the compliance for this, and something in the $60 to $250,000 a year in annual maintenance fees. And obviously that varies widely. The major challenge for most of these businesses is there's no catalog software. If you're a cataloger, you've originated software to support your business. You have legacy software, if you will. And we're talking about probably the most important thing that a business would follow, the money, and how the money flows through your business. So every interface in your legacy system that has to do with money has to then interface with any proposed certified software provider or other solution that we might come to. Beyond just the compliance cost, I think the biggest concern my members have expressed is the consumer confusion. And they spend a lot of time trying to streamline the path to purchase, that's what we call it, make it as simple as possible for people to find what they want and make a decision and hopefully buy it. And anything that gets in the way of that is a problem for a cataloger, or frankly for any remote marketer. The concern around being subject to multiple audits, that's very scary for most business people. They're certainly already getting heavily audited, or at least routinely audited in their home state, but to take that up by a magnitude of as much as 46 times is very disconcerting. And just the sheer complexity of dealing with all of the differing tax rates. We have a number of members who have tried to figure out what this might look like. One of our members came up with, well, I should say, you're probably familiar in a catalog with an order sheet that says at the bottom, Louisiana residents add such and such, or Texas residents, or Michigan residents, they'll put the local tax rate. And that's a fairly straightforward thing I think most consumers are familiar with. To try to complete or comply with marketplace fairness, one of our members said, well, okay, well, how are we going to express this? I guess we have to have a tax lookup that we insert in our into our catalog that has all the various rates. And actually, it got to be about 56 pages and quite a bit, if you don't mind, quite a bit longer. This is 6-point type. He didn't put everything in. There's a couple that are just abridged. So this is the minimum effort to start with, but that's a pretty scary compliance and cost structure. And there's a lot of room for error. Different products are defined differently in different states. For instance, this is a scooter that will provide locomotion to people that may not be able to walk easily. It's exempt from tax in Louisiana, but it's taxable in New York. And you multiply this by an average cataloger may have 2,000 or 20,000 different products in a variety of different categories. They're introducing new products all the time. A fourth, a third, a half of their products each year will be new. They have to identify the product, identify all of the definitions of how that product is considered. Is it in the case of a therapeutic sock? Is it a medical device? Is it an article of clothing? And then understand all the implications for the sales tax holidays. The complexity of this is very daunting. I have a picture here of the sales tax order form. It's hard to see. We just talked about that. But so while computing the tax, if you know what the percentage is fairly simple for some of us. Some of us aren't so good at math. The classification of products, the sales tax holidays are all a bit daunting. And if you're a mail, as I say, 10% of Americans ordering from catalogs actually mail their orders into the catalog vendor. And remember, that's 0 in some cases and 40% in others. It varies fairly widely. If you miscompute what is due and you send your order in, what does the vendor do at that point? Do they call you up and say, excuse me, ma'am, excuse me, mister, you owe us another $3? Or what if they overpay? Does the company then have to refund the money? So that is a bit of concern as well, to say the least. So I just put this picture up, but the way that we communicate and manage this in the catalog industry is a real challenge. And what we've seen in even our discussions with Chaffetz's staff around how they may change the Marketplace Fairness Act as it exists today still don't provide any solution for a customer that is using the mail, particularly a rural or older American that depends on the mail, may not have high-speed access, may not have computer literacy. So that's a real challenge that, at least as far as we've been able to see from the hybrid origin system, is solved. The risk to businesses is significant as well. The catalog industry is a high-volume, low-margin business. It's just like retail. A lot of these folks are retailers. A lot of them have retail stars. A lot of them started as retailers, and then as big box stores came to town, they decided they better diversify to give a broader audience to their products. Terry Alpert is a member of ours who works with craftsmen all through the United States, artisans that wouldn't be able to get their product to Marketplace otherwise. And she sells those, and she says, you know, as I look at the compliance cost, I don't see how we could make it. I don't see how our small little business, 50 people in Connecticut, would be able to execute against this. Oh, for some reason, my clicker is not working. Would you advance the slide? Better than a lot of different state solutions. That the idea of each state coming up with their own approach to this in any shape, manner, or form is very worrisome to us, obviously. We have some significant concerns about the Marketplace Fairness Act. We see the hybrid origin sourcing is just basically doing what we're doing today. I happen to live in Rhode Island. I drive all through New England. I love New Hampshire, but I also go to Vermont. I don't make a decision to ski in New Hampshire as opposed to ski in Vermont because of sales tax. And I certainly am in Massachusetts. It's literally a couple of miles from me. And I know when I go to Massachusetts, I pay a different sales tax than I pay in Rhode Island. But I'm used to dealing with that because it's the states that I'm already in. It's the states that I have a business in or have a physical presence in. the real advantages of that, I think, are fairly obvious. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you, and appreciate your trying to figure this out in a sensible and reasonable way. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitney from PayPal, and can I remind you, please, 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
Thank
Madam
you.
Chair, members of the committee, Devin Whitney with the PayPal Government Relations team. I actually wasn't given any advance notice that I would be called to the witness table today, so I don't have a prepared presentation to give you guys. So I suppose it would be best to use my time up here to perhaps let you ask questions of me, if that would be all right with you.
Great, and I was worried about another over presentation. So thank you very much for that. Do any of the task force members have any questions for either of these two gentlemen? Yes, ma'am. Representative Almay from New Hampshire.
I'm not sure whether it's to one of you or to Mr. Davison, but did the bill as it passed the Senate include mail-in catalogs? Because I was under the impression they were being exempted, even though that does create problems. I mean, like I look at my mail catalogs and then I go online, or I go online and then I go to the mail-in catalog. I get a choice.
I do believe most consumers are savvy enough to do the same. Mr. Davison?
Yes, if you're comfortable with using a computer, as we both are, then frequently one is essentially equal to the other. We make no differentiation as a consumer. To your first question, my understanding is there is no exemption from the Marketplace Fairness Act as passed in the Senate last year for catalog companies.
Assemblyman Ortiz from New York.
Yeah, I'm very curious because you put New York on taxes and you left Louisiana behind. So I want to make sure that we are fair with taxes in New York. I'm just kidding. That's a
I'm
joke.
sorry, I'm having a little hard time hearing you.
It's about the taxes. You put New York as a taxes. That's a great example of how expensive we are in New York. But my question is regarding the catalogs. Do every catalog have a website? Do every one of them have a website? And
Yes, there's no significant size catalog company over a couple of $1 million of sales that wouldn't have a fairly sophisticated e-commerce deployment.
And they also have a storefronts, right? I assume.
Some do, some do not. It really depends on the history of the company, the product, the temperament of the owner, a lot of different variation there. Certainly, some of our members have as many as 700, 800 stores. So they're already in, say, 20, 25 states and would welcome the simplification that might occur here. Others just have a single store, if they have a store at all, in the state that they do business in, or they may have stores in a variety of nearby states.
Any of the other members? My question would be, we're in the age of customer service, and obviously most of our large entities are bending over backwards to try and retain their customers and provide that service. With regard to how difficult it would be for someone to determine what tax to pay, could we not do something again on a website where that information would be provided at a click of a button, or a toll-free number, which everyone is familiar with utilizing? I mean, wouldn't that be an easy answer to trying to figure out, as opposed to that 6-point type and 56 pages of information?
Yes, certainly for those people that are, from the consumer perspective, that are using the website or calling into a call center, provided that the catalog marketer could figure it out and execute, there would not be inconvenience. From the consumer perspective, the real problem comes in with the 10% of orders that are received through the mail. And again, that's in some cases 30 or 40% for some companies and nearly zero for others, most disproportionately on rural and older Americans. Those are the people that would be particularly affected by this.
Okay, thank you. And anyone else? Yes, Representative Link.
I tend not to use this because it usually gets me in trouble, but I just can't stop right now. It may be the same group that's affected by voter ID in those states that have passed those laws.
Representative Almay.
Yes, thank you. Just following up on that, on how many of your catalog only on buyers do you think on or rather sellers, do you think would have a 24-hour, be able to afford a 24-hour customer service line to tell people what the sales tax was going to be? Because
Well, I haven't done any
Use them in
research
the
on
middle
that,
of the
so I'll
night.
give you my opinion. Mostly today, they do not staff a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week call center. They tend to cluster it when people are calling, and it's not business hours, but extended business hours. Certainly the website would be available 24/7, 365, but I don't think any other way of contacting would be. And a lot of people don't necessarily pick up the phone. About, as I say, 10% just fill out an order form and mail it.
Thank you. Any other questions for this panel? Representative Perone?
Thank you very much. I just had a quick question, something that's been sort of gnawing at me. Before I was a legislator, I was in direct marketing, and if you had a 1.5% response, that was a pretty good week. If you had 2%, that's you can go home early that week. It was good news. The question though is that we spent an inordinate amount of time on understanding and simplifying our order forms, our order process to really take as much onus off the buyer as possible. And going forward, just the way the trends are, and wouldn't it be more than likely that as needed, that the calculations, everything required to compute the tax would be, assuming that people would just be more or less, if this is any indication, people would go to the website as soon as they get the catalog or want to make an order, that everything would be computed there, that it would be written into the software of the website, so they wouldn't have to do the calculations themselves. I guess what I'm saying is, just the general trend of technology is, I think, it's less likely that the customer is going to have to make these calculations themselves. And do you see that trend, or is that because that seems to be more and more the case?
Well, certainly the internet has changed everything, and the internet certainly has changed catalog marketing, and a significant number, half or so, a little more than half even, orders come in via the internet. So from that perspective, the only real concern with MFA is the compliance cost, and the consumer confusion about why a product was taxed at one rate this time and at a different rate during a sales tax holiday, and or has changed definitions. Some of that could be a consumer burden. But we still have about 10% of the orders that are coming in via the mail, and that's been fairly stable, even through the growth of the internet in the last 5 years. So we don't really have a solution for that piece of it, and that represents a lot of Americans and obviously a lot of commerce as well.
Sorry, one more question, because the concept of demographics came up earlier. Certainly a lot of senior citizens tend to take advantage more of direct marketing approaches, catalog approaches. And do you see situations, is it more likely that it would depress response to have a scheme where the end user would have to do more of the computations on their end?
Well, that's an absolute concern, and you're right on with your, obviously you have a background in the direct marketing business. Anything that creates confusion or complexity is going to depress response rate, and it will be difficult for this whole industry sector to respond to.
Yes, Representative Almay?
Thank you. I think I've said this in past meetings, but people also have to remember that a lot of you live in cities. I'm at the center of a micropolis, which is high-tech. I live 3 miles away from the DSL, so the only option that I have for anything other than dial-up is an extremely expensive Comcast bill. And there are a lot of little places all over America like that, and Comcast is monopoly, and they keep on raising the rates, and a lot of my constituents keep on dropping out. Thank you.
Assemblyman Ortiz from New York.
I would not talk about Comcast, but that's another New York issue. So let me, yes, I just want to, probably the question is not probably appropriate for this forum, but I have a quick question follow-up on direct marketing. The Hispanic community, they get a lot of direct marketing and catalogs, and it's a lot of fraud.
You say fraud?
Fraud that is behind of this, especially that you have some of these catalogs that are being coming from, like, for example, South and Central America, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico. And people have a tendency within my community to go into and listen to Univision, Telemundo, and go and buy products or believing that they are buying some product. Do you guys have any guideline and control over this magnitude of catalogs outside United States as well?
No, we do not.
Okay, but their market also could be in Texas.
Yes, it could be, or Florida, or California, or anywhere else Hispanics have to be.
That's correct.
Yeah, but no, we are not. We have no overseas members, and we have no influence of that population. We certainly do have members that market to Hispanics as U.S. businesses, but no, nothing offshore.
I would like to follow up with you after the
I'll give you my card.
presentation. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions at this time for this panel? Gentlemen, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to call up the next panel, which is Mike Massey of Massey's Professional